Is it red?
It's red.
All right.
Everything's red.
Okay, we'll get going here. We're in a interlude in our study of the book of Romans, and on predestination, and the subject of predestination is an important one because, let's face it, is we focus more and more on home fellowships. You can't get around the fact that if Christians and people in general think everything is predetermined, that's a disincentive to be diligent. And even though there are many verses in the Bible that seem to indicate everything is a settled issue and everything is predestined, first century Christians in the various accounts of life in the Christian fast lane that we see in the Bible, it's very evident that the apostles and early Christians did not function at all like everything was predetermined. They functioned very much like that it depended on what they did. And could you grab my coffee out of the microwave? Thank you. And I saw Mom take a drink there and forgot mine. So, at any rate, thank you very much. That's important. You can't get around the fact that if people think, there's a disincentive, that everything's predetermined, it's a disincentive. And Calvinists talk a lot about, we evangelize more than anybody because whatever their reasons are. I'm not buying it. I was a Calvinist for 20 years, okay? And I can tell you evangelism is low on the list, all right? So it's an important issue. But the more and more I study the issue, the more things are beginning to make sense to me. But on the other hand, I'm beginning to see how much power there is in being conditioned to think a certain way and look through things through a given prism. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So we're not talking about predestination today. We'll continue that interlude in our study of the book of Romans next week. And of course, this is a change of thinking for me because, as you know, my position all along is that, hey, look, Christians don't understand justification by and large. Why do we need to worry about election? But as we get closer and closer at focusing on the home fellowship movement, and putting our focus there, it's important to me that we have a right understanding, a right proper mentality about how we function as Christians. Today, we're taking an interlude within an interlude, this time a short one, and since it's Easter Sunday, we're going to talk about Easter Sunday. And this is mostly a history lesson, if that's okay. All right, this is a history lesson. So here we are. It's another Easter Sunday, a celebration of Christ's resurrection, right? Many people will attend the institutional churches today who don't normally attend. After all, spring is in the air, and colorful flowers are sprouting up from the ashes of winter's death. This marks the beginning of the season of resurrection, symbolized by the primary Western God, Jesus. Okay? Even my missionary daughter, whom I'm very proud of, posted a colorful placard on Facebook with the nomenclature, "He has risen." All right? Indeed he has, and don't get me wrong, that truth of Christ's resurrection is very dear to my soul. So don't get me wrong there. Here at the Potter's House Home Fellowship, I would like to think our minds function like a friend told me computers function. According to him, computers operate by a massive series of open and closed gates. He explained it as, or this way, yes or no, yes or no, yes or no, yes or no. It's just this, and I've seen this work in its simplicity as I installed the security system in a very high security situation in a concrete mansion where the previous owner of a well-known baseball team owned in the early 40s, right around World War II, was the owner of the house. It was made out of concrete and undoubtedly was the first automated controls that were ever in a house. And it was done with these, you would go into these closets and there were these massive boards with, oh my goodness, almost 100 in one closet of simple relays all working together. So when you walked into a room and a light automatically came on, or whatever the automation was, you would hear these closets go clankety, clankety, clankety. Well, now we have integrated circuitry that takes all of those simple relays and puts them in a chip about that big, right? This is how I would like to think our minds work. Yes, no, yes, no. Perhaps this is akin to the 1/0 code that I see at times referring to computer code. Just a series of ones and zeros, right? 1 being yes, 0 being no. All right. I would like to think our minds function that way. As we hear words, a yes or no is determined. If you will, truth or untruth. If you read, here's what Psalm 119:30 says. The unfolding of your words give light. It imparts understanding to the simple. The word for unfolding in the Hebrew refers to an open door. We are to close the door to words that don't lend understanding. All right. So if the psalmist says the unfolding of your words give light. In other words, the opening of the door of your words gives light. All right. So obviously, we don't want to open the door to anything that's darkness or untrue. All right. So in 2 Corinthians, we see the same thing. You could even connect this up with Jesus in the book of Revelation. I stand at the door and knock. If anybody hears my voice and lets me in, I'll have fellowship with him. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 10:5, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. And it's interesting, every thought, and he doesn't distinguish that from our own thoughts and other person's thoughts. It's all thoughts, period. We take those thoughts captive and bring them into obedience to Christ. Like the computer idiom, trash in, trash out, when it gets right down to it, the code we allow into our minds would determine our life. And I wonder how well a computer would work according to the following code: 1.5, 0.5, 1.5, 0.5. Perhaps a reader of PPT can illumine us according to that question. The focus is on Easter Sunday, and we think of the Last Supper as being something different. And we think of the Lord's table as being something different. A careful examination of the scriptures exposes this as being an anomaly. Easter is supposedly representative of the Jewish Passover. Every scholar gives at least tacit affirmation to that. But in accordance with our lazy thinking, we don't think about what doesn't add up. What doesn't add up in all of this? The Last Supper was Jesus' participation in the Feast of Unleavened Bread that lasted 7 days, beginning with the Passover meal. That's the Last Supper. All right. At the Last Supper, Jesus instructed his assembly to participate in the Lord's table. And not only is it not about resurrection at all, what does Passover refer to? The Exodus, right? The death angel passed over your home during the Exodus if what had taken place? If you slew a lamb according to a prescribed method and put the blood over your doorpost. All right?
Doorpost and lintels.
Right.
Sides and top.
The doorpost perhaps signifying the cross. Could be. I wouldn't be dogmatic about that. So, in Mark 14:22, here's what we read. And as they were eating, he took, that is Jesus, and after blessing, he broke it and gave it to them and said, after blessing the bread, he broke it and gave it to them and said, Take this is my body. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they drank it. Stop right there. All right. What I'm going to discuss a little bit as is the information we have in the New Testament regarding this meal is massive. John 14 through 17 is probably, all of that probably happened at this supper. Okay? There was this lengthy lesson and encouragement by Jesus to the apostles. It was in somebody's home. All right? The meal was at somebody's home. Notice that he takes the bread and he blesses it. But then he prays over the whatever they were drinking, grapefruit or grape juice or wine or whatever it was. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant." The covenant. I do think that's definitive. All right. Speaking of the new covenant, which was to who? Jeremiah 31. It was to Israel, which is poured out for many. Now this is the one thing that we forget. The new covenant that Jesus is referring to, or the covenant, was to Israel. The covenant was to Israel. Okay? Salvation goes through Israel. Alright? Via Christ, of course. The book of Acts makes it plain. Christ went to the cross for Israel. Initially, Christ went to the lost sheep of Israel. Okay? After that, the Gentiles were grafted in. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. And just a thought that kind of just came into my mind when Jesus came back after he was resurrected. They had him eat, I think, a piece of fish and I think maybe a piece of bread. But he didn't drink anything. And I can't say that I know what all of that is about at this point. It means something. I hate to be a party pooper, but do you see anything there about the resurrection? Okay? And why was it called Passover? What was passed over? When did it happen? Who did it happen to? I have no qualms about the resurrection being spoken of during Easter, but why is the emphasis other biblical? Why is it? The emphasis on Easter Sunday is not Israel, and it's not the death of Christ. The emphasis is resurrection. Why is that? Well, in 1 Corinthians 11, 23, 25, which is important because look, whenever we study the Bible, all right, we have these big solemn ceremonies that are considered something totally separate from Easter, quote unquote, and that is the Lord's table. All right? I don't know, I've never been in a church that had the Lord's table on Easter. Have you?
In the evening service.
Evening service? Okay.
And
I have personally never been in a Reformed church or otherwise where the Lord table was really thought of as something totally different from Easter Sunday. Yeah.
I was always told in the churches that I went to, fundamental churches, the reason they did not have communion on Easter Sunday morning is because of so many visitors there that may not be believers and would partake unawares or would partake of the Lord's table as an unbeliever. So they would do it in the evening service where more than likely the attendance would be by believers.
Okay. So if you think about what Andy Young harps so much about, is the problem therefore the encouragement of getting non-Christians into church, because then you're dealing with those kind of issues, right? People being offended because they can't partake in the whole service, not understanding that that is not just symbolism, that it means something, so on and forth. So this is just another dilemma of the institutional church. So, you know, is it compromise? Is that approach compromise? And then, again, you know, the whole rigmarole that you have before the Lord's table at all churches, where they have to explain this is for believers only. You know, some churches you have to be an actual member there to partake. Other churches you don't have to be a member, but you know, they warn you that you should be a believer. This all is under the auspices of closed and open communion. Just another issue, more drama that comes part and parcel with the institutional church. Okay? Why? Because I've come to believe it's not an institution. Alright? At any rate, so the question becomes, alright, if we want to interpret the Bible properly, this is something that Christ initiated with only who present?
His disciples, his apostles.
The apostles. Okay? So, you know, we know historically the Lord's table was something done in the home churches for 300-400 years, but was that right or was that wrong? Well, we find out it's right. 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 30:25, Paul says, we find out in 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 25, we find out that Christ also instructed his assemblies to do this as often as they ate together. Historically, This was a very informal remembrance like it was there. Okay, so historically, they did this. Was it correct? Well, we find out in 1 Corinthians 11:25 through 25 that yes, Paul says that part of the instruction of Christ was that it was done as often as they ate together. All right. Now, I didn't have time to research it, but I don't remember that being said in any of the gospel accounts. All right. So what Paul mentions there in the book of Corinth, was that something the Lord told him that he said at that supper that's not recorded in the Gospels? Okay? What makes that interesting? Well, it's interesting that this would not be the only case, and again, I didn't have time to go back and confirm this. This is not the only case where things are deliberately left out of, some parts of scriptures, but then later on, it's revealed, and that's done purposely to show the continuity of the Bible and give authority and credence to all of the writers together, showing the working together of how they wrote the Bible and the leading of the Holy Spirit. All right, so it is something that we are to do every time we meet together as Christians, which most churches don't, and we haven't begun to do it in, the Potter's house. So, with that, I have an excerpt to read. And this is from, following up on this point, this is from the book Reimagining Church, Pursuing the Dream of Organic Christianity, by Frank Viola, I believe. The Lord's Banquet, or the Lord's Supper. Here we go. Contrary to today's practice, the early church took the Lord's Supper in the context of a normal meal. When Jesus instituted the supper, it was taken as part of the Passover feast. In fact, the Passover was the forerunner of the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians 11 makes clear that the early Christians gathered to eat the supper as a meal. Some in the church at Corinth weren't waiting for their brethren to show up to the meeting. The result? Those who ate were full, and those who showed up late went hungry. In addition, the Corinthian Christians were getting drunk at the supper. All right? Now think, and he has the Bible citations here. Now think, he says, is it possible to get drunk on a thimble of grape juice and satisfy one's hunger with a bite-sized cracker? All right? So this wasn't, is that not a fabulous point? I don't know much about Frank Viola and Barna, whatever his first name is. I think it's also Frank Barna, another Frank. I know very little about these guys, but this is good. This is usable. The New Testament word for supper literally means a dinner, a meal, or a banquet. And the Greek word for table refers to a table in which a full meal is spread. Again, he's got all of the Bible references here. To the first century Christians, the Lord's Supper was just that, a supper. It was a banquet, a potluck dinner that included bread and wine. It was the table communion of the saints, a family festival. It was a fellowship meal. By it, the Christians who were better off monetarily showed their love and concern for their less fortunate brother. This ran against the grain of Greco-Roman norms, where class distinctions were sharply recognized during banquets. But not so with the Christians. In the supper, the early believers showed their unity and oneness, ignoring social distinctions of class and race. Perhaps this is why the early church referred to the supper as the agape feast. Regrettably, centuries of ecclesiastical traditions have made today's truncated version of the supper an event that is far removed from what it was in the first century. As eminent scholar Edward Schweitzer notes, eminent, would that be correct? What is that?
I see the word. Yeah, eminent.
Eminent, okay. As eminent scholar Edward Schweitzer notes, quote, a practice which separates the sacrament from the brotherhood meal turns the former into a strange, almost heathen rite, which totally lacks the bodily expression in the context of the whole life of its participants. Consequently, the communal meeting of the breaking of bread has been largely lost to us. It's no longer the Lord's Supper. Today's version would better be called the Savior's Sampler, the Nazarene Niblet, or the Lord's Appetizer. Forgive the humor, but can we really call a cracker crumb and a shot glass of grape juice a supper? Right? And then he goes on to really break this down and get into this in depth. Why do we do what we do? Why don't we ask questions? Because there's nothing lazier than the thinking of a Western Christian. There's really not. We're lazy thinkers, okay? And it's the primary reason Christianity in America, at least, is not even a good joke anymore, okay? Furthermore, Christians continued to recognize most of the Jewish customs and feasts after Christ's resurrection. All right? Look. The church, as it's called, let me turn that over. People are looking at the pictures. I should know better than that. So anyway, look, I've said this before, I'll say it again. 3,000 people get saved at Pentecost. A day later, they're just doing church. How did that happen? Because the so-called church, which is not a biblical word, the literal word is called out assembly, ecclesia, I believe. So basically, it's Jewish. Most synagogues were home fellowships, okay? Especially after the destruction of the Second Temple. After Pentecost, the Jewish Christians, followers of Jesus, the Way, as it was called, just really pretty much, as far as how they practiced fellowshipping together and worshiping, just picked up where it left off. Okay? So anyway, they kept on. And much of the Jewish customs and traditions and feasts continued to be practiced by the first century Christians.
They did not cease being Jews simply because they accepted Christ as their Messiah. They continued in their Jewishness.
Right. They did. And again, the new covenant was a covenant to Israel. Jeremiah 31. Okay, the covenant was to Israel. So at any rate, we have Paul recognizing the Passover in Acts 18, also 1 Corinthians 5:7. Paul mentioned that he went to the days of unleavened bread, Acts 20, again, 1 Corinthians 5:7. He noted that he went to the Feast of Pentecost, again, Acts 20. Let me see here, several examples here. Acts 27, there's a reference to the fact that Paul was disappointed that because of the ship was going too slow that he missed Yom Kippur, okay? So this carried on, all right? And, you know, I would have to do a thorough study to really come to terms with to what extent we should do this. But here's where we're going to get, as long as time allows, into the history of where we get where we're at today. All right? And it looks like that we've been going for around a half an hour or so. So I'm probably going to end up summarizing this. Okay? This is from an article from Christ's Assembly to the Institutional Church, the History and Philosophical Progression. Okay, it's an article I wrote on PPT, and I do have some visual aids here that we'll look at, not just yet. I don't want to forget that. So how did we get to where we're at today with the whole Easter thing? All right, well, we're going to find out. It can be tracked historically and begins with the passing of Peter and Paul, who were most formidable of the apostles. And Peter was the rock of the church, and Peter wrote 13 of the 27 books that make up the New Testament. The passing of these two apostles created a leadership vacuum.
Peter wrote that many, or Paul?
Paul. Did I say Peter? Yeah. Yeah. Paul wrote 13 of the 27 books. Christ himself said Peter was the rock of the church. The passing of these two apostles created a huge leadership vacuum. Also left behind was no shortage of theologians, many of them products of the apostles and their disciples. The most prominent ones are known as the church fathers. Ever heard of them? For example, one church father, Polycarp, was a disciple of the apostle John. These men were very influential leaders of that day and had different ideas in regard to apostolic succession. This is the key word here. All right, apostolic succession. Some believe that the apostles laid the foundation of Christ's assembly and set it in motion without the need for further apostolic oversight. In other words, it was just going to go to what it had always been with the Jews, starting back at the book of Exodus, when they are all camped out around the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the central place of worship where they did worship, for lack of a better term, where they did their rituals that spoke of things to come or whatever, or the covering of sin. But in the camps, the whole assembly of the Jews was split up into groups led by elders. When Moses goes up the mountain to talk with God and get the 10 Commandments, at one point, we studied that, all of the coming down and goings up. Okay, at one point, Moses was instructed to take Aaron and 70 elders with him. All right. This is a pattern that goes way, 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 way back from the beginning an assembly, a small assembly or group of believers being led by an elder. Okay? Others believed that the church was doomed to chaos without doctrinal oversight. However, so basically I believe that scriptures make it clear that it was the 12. Okay? When New Jerusalem comes down from heaven, the foundation is made up of the 12 apostles. When the apostles died out, leadership was handed over to a vast array of elders from generation to generation. Okay? However, though the apostles certainly possessed some categories of authority, they made themselves accountable to the general populace of Christians according to Scripture, as we previously, as we previously developed, that was strongly supported by some of the church fathers. I can't read this corner here. Specifically, that the church at Rome should have oversight of all the assemblies. So let me paraphrase this real part of the article is missing here on the corner. I may have a page out of order. So basically, here's what we have. We have the New Testament model that puts much confidence in the collective wisdom of people in general, and being led by elders. Okay? Elders that lead by example, and the direction determined by the unanimity of the people. We see this clearly when there was the dispute over the Greek widows that weren't being properly attended to in the beginning of the church early on, right? The elders came out and say, listen, here's our idea for dealing with this. And it pleased the people, and as Andy well pointed out in his study in the book of Acts, it was left to the people to choose who these seven guys were. Okay? Do I want to call it a representative republic or a democracy? No, but it certainly wasn't some kind of dictatorship with a central hierarchy. Okay? For the most part, the assemblies of Christ, this was their idea. This was their ideal. Now, when Peter and Paul passed away, many of the church fathers became engrossed in this controversy concerning apostolic succession. Part of them said, no, there's got to be successors to the apostles, or there will be chaos. All right, there will be chaos. Man, in and of himself, or the collective man, is not competent to rule. Okay? The masses are not enlightened enough to have self-governance with representation. This is it in a nutshell. And this issue cuts across religion, politics, everything. All right? In our government today, it's the difference between Republicans and Democrats. Hate to say it, but for the most part, are Democrats confident that people can take care of themselves and make good decisions? Say no. Unless you don't watch the news, then you don't know. At any rate, so there were some of the apostolic fathers who believed in apostolic succession. One of these church fathers was Irenaeus. You ever heard of him? I have a quote here where he says, and this is from Against Heresies, book 3, and it's not like the Calvin Institute, so it's 333. I'm not sure what the other 2 3s are. I assume that the first 3 is book 3. He stated, the blessed apostles then, having founded and built up the church, committed unto the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Alright, so basically some of the church fathers just took it upon themselves to appoint a head, not elder, they then called it bishops. And this right here, after the departure of Paul and Peter, you have a split amongst the church fathers on this. Really not much of a split. Very few of the church fathers said, no. You know, it's elder rule, it's the collective will of the saints led by elders. No. Most of the church fathers thought some kind of succession was needed. I think even Polycarp would have been in this camp. Okay? This right here, and you're talking 70 AD, begins the great debate in the early church of bishop versus elder. Okay? Most of the home fellowships, or many of them, I shouldn't say most, many of them just, ignored it. We're going to keep doing what we do in our homes with our elders. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. But herein lies the bishop versus elder. Okay? Linus technically is the first pope that came out of the church fathers. You ever wonder where the Catholic Church came from? It came out of the church fathers, who were actually disciples of the apostles. So, why Rome? Why the church at Rome? Right? The church at Rome would have been like all other churches. The church at Rome, which was made up of a network of home fellowships. They appoint Linus, and Rome was the focus because there was an immediate intent to be on good terms with the government, to combine the two. So Linus right away takes it upon himself. Well, I don't know if it was Linus in particular, but these church fathers appoint Linus. Linus and his successors collectively take it upon themselves then to appoint bishops to oversee Christian territories, and those bishops then reported to the big cheese bishop in Rome. This is the beginning of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church came out of the church fathers. When the Roman Catholic Church says that they came out of the Christian church fathers, they're absolutely telling the truth. Okay, now when they say that Peter was the first pope, no, that's a lie. But everything else, pretty much true. Alright? So, Irenaeus also identified Linus as the same who was an associate of Paul, mentioned in 2 Timothy 4:2:1. So in 2 Timothy 4:2:1, there's a Linus mentioned there. And Irenaeus, one of the, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, one of the early church fathers said that Linus was the very Linus that was appointed as the first bishop, not yet called popes. Popes didn't come along until 5th century. Okay, but this is the great debate here: bishops versus elder. All right. So where it goes from there is pretty interesting. Now, I'm not going to have time to read all of this, so I'm going to begin to kind of paraphrase it here. You can read the article yourself. If you go to Paul's Passing Thoughts and do a search under the search articles, this is from Christ's Assembly to the Institutional Church, the history and philosophical progression. I have several citations here from the church fathers talking about this apostolic succession debate. Okay? And pretty much, we need Linus, we need a big cheese pope in Rome, or everything is just going to fall apart. Apostolic succession is where it's at. Paul and Peter and the apostles must be replaced. It's strange that they thought they needed to be replaced with one guy, but that's what it was. And again, Linus and his successors take it upon themselves, especially Clement, First Clement, who was the 4th bishop of Rome, I believe, takes it upon themselves to start appointing bishops to oversee these home fellowships. And of course, the focus also became to institutionalize the church with buildings where everybody met versus home fellowships. And Polycarp and company were very much on board with this. I think a mentality that they presently regret. Okay, so that's what's going on. I paraphrase there. Think primarily the bishop-elder controversy. Okay, now let's skip on to, we're skipping a bunch of history here, but I'm giving you the thumbnail. All right, let's go now to the, I am going to now give you your picture, okay, and you can pass that down to Mom. Oh, and I didn't leave myself one, okay. No, we don't have to share. I have my copy, yeah, I have my copy right here, we're all good. Now, this gives you an idea of the timelines of how all of these characters' lives overlapped. Alright? The vertical lines represent these people's lifespans. See how they overlap there? Okay? See how they overlap in how John lived to around 100 AD. Linus lived to about 80 AD. Polycarp lived to 150, but it all overlaps. Irenaeus there, the church father, would have been born near the time of the death of the Apostle Paul, within 20 years or so. Okay? So, see Clement of Rome there? Okay? Clement of Rome, I believe, was 3rd or 2nd after Linus, as far as being the Bishop of Rome. Okay? And we have a very interesting letter that he wrote that is not part of scriptural canon, but it's called First Clement. And the reason that letter is so important is because it gives wonderful insight into this bishop versus elder, what ended up up being practically a war, okay? So here's what happened. I'm going to paraphrase this. As we know, the church at Corinth during the time of the Apostle Paul had a bunch of problems, okay? What's interesting about the problems at that church, there was a home fellowship in the home of, I'm going to pronounce her name, Chloe, and they were pretty sharp Christians, but they sent a messenger to Paul squealing on the rest of the home fellowships who were abusing the Lord's table, getting drunk at the Lord's table, eating all of the food before the poor people or the slaves got off work, because the people who had money didn't work, only the slaves worked. So the people in that culture in Corinth, which would be very much a Greco-Roman culture, wherein people who had money didn't work, like I said, only the slaves worked. They were getting to the fellowships early and eating all of the food and getting drunk before the slaves showed up. So the slaves would come in and there wouldn't be any food left. All right. There were also a whole bunch of other problems. There was a feminist movement during that time that came out of the Greco-Roman culture. Okay. And this feminist movement was a real feminist movement. Okay. It wasn't the wimpy stuff we have today. These women went through the streets bare-breasted and speared pigs in the street and stuff, wearing helmets. They were pretty crazy. They were saved, a lot of them, and came into the church or the assemblies, and while an elder was trying to teach in a home fellowship, they would just jump up and start speaking in tongues. Okay, lots of crazy stuff was going on. I may not have all of that right. Lots of craziness. So Paul writes 2 letters to them, and here's the long and the short of it. The church of Corinth ended up encompassing a much larger area than Corinth, and I talk about it in the article. And someplace here I have a map. Achaia, all right, if that's the right pronunciation. Their network extended to Athenia and Achaia, a very large area network of churches. Corinth, by Clement's admission in 1 Clement, became a very large network of very, very strong Christian assemblies. They grew up. Paul nurtured them. Paul addressed these problems, and they grew up. And this was an incredibly strong network of spiritual elders and a thriving Christian network with an awesome testimony for God. Okay, Clement admits this in his letter. Well, why did Clement send this letter to the church of Corinth? Here's why. Because out of nowhere, Rome sends a bunch of bishops to Corinth to integrate the home assemblies, and they just kind of walk in and say, they're here to oversee. All right? And Clement appointed a bishop over Corinth, that reported to him, so on and so forth. Well, guess what happened? The elders and the people said, no, don't think so. And they sent these guys packing. They excommunicated them. So, Clement sends this letter known as 1 Clement, and I have several citations here from the letter of him really threatening them that they need to receive these bishops, that they need to repent and receive these bishops back into the fellowship. Let me read a few snippets. All right. Let me see here. This is great. You ready for this? First Clement 44:1. And our apostles knew through our Lord Jesus Christ that there would be strife over the name of the bishop's office. So he goes on to accuse the elders at Corinth of being jealous of the bishops. Okay? Because they had power and they didn't. Well, the elders led by example. Okay? And it was collective direction. All right? Just right. One accord. Exactly. For this cause, he goes on to say, therefore, having received complete foreknowledge, that is the apostles, they appointed the aforesaid persons, and afterwards they provided a continuance, that if these should fall asleep, other approved men should succeed in their mainstream. All right? So this is apostolic succession by bishops, and then the bishopry being a perpetual or a self-perpetuating office that governed. All right. Those therefore who were appointed by them or afterward other men of repute with the consent of the whole church, and have ministered unblameably to the flock of Christ in lowliness of mind, peacefully and with all modesty, and for a long time have borne good report with all these men we consider to be unjustly thrust out from their ministration. All right. So they were kicked out. Let me see here. Oh, there were other problems with these bishops. Apparently, when these bishops first came in, the churches at Corinth, or the assemblies at Corinth, kind of put up with them. All right, if you want to act like you have authority over us, but other controversies arose. In Clement 40:2 through 4:1, there's this reference. Now the offerings and ministrations he commanded to be performed with care, and not to be done rashly in disorder, but in fixed times and seasons. Get the drift? The Lord's table was too what? Informal. All right? It was being done without care. It was being done rashly and in disorder. Okay? Because it wasn't this big, solemn, Now, this probably does not only refer to the Lord's table alone, but probably the way they did things in general. It is shameful, dear beloved, yes, utterly shameful and unworthy of your conduct in Christ, that it should be reported that the very steadfast and ancient church of the Corinthians, for the sake of one or two persons, maketh sedition against its presbyters. So he's pointing to 2 or 3 elders who were taking the lead and saying, these guys are out of here. And the rest of the assembly said, yeah, we agree. Okay, and they kicked him out. I don't know about you, but this just I think this is awesome. This just tickles me. Okay. He goes on in 1 Corinthians, senseless and stupid and foolish and ignorant men jeer and mock at us, desiring that they themselves should be exalted in their imaginations. How dare these elders stand up against our rule? Okay? You're submitting yourselves, because the people were following these guys. He's accusing them of submitting to ignorant, stubborn, we assume elders. All right? This goes on and on and on and on, and I have several citations here. In 65:1, we find out that he sent messengers with these letters, and then these messengers were instructed to stay in Corinth to get an answer from all the people about what they were going to do. Okay, so the pressure's really on here. Now, these controversies developed into one of the controversies in this between bishops and elders. Here we go. This is the point here, the crux of the lesson. It developed into a controversy over the Christ assembly, lack of a better term, the churches, their recognition of the Jewish Passover. Rome, the bishops of Rome, started pushing against this. And, these bishops of Rome, of course, for up until the 4th century, are legends in their own mind, and were gaining power over the people through academic intimidation, aristocracy versus peasantry, propaganda, but to a large extent, the solid Christian assemblies were thumbing their nose up at them. All right? Well, one of the primary controversies that pops up is the recognition of the Jewish Passover by churches, the home assemblies, who were recognizing Passover and partaking in Passovers pretty much exactly like the apostles did and Christ did, according to Jewish tradition. Okay? The bishops in Rome had a problem with it on two whys. Okay? On two accounts. One, Jewish tradition was the Old Testament. Hey guys, wake up. We're in the New Testament. Okay? The bishops at Rome didn't like the recognition of Jewish customs. Anti-Semitism, is what it was. Alright? Secondly, it wasn't the same date as what the church in Rome, the parts that were overruled, the churches that were overseen by the bishops had integrated the recognition of Passover into the feast of Easter, the Easter feast. Okay? The Easter feast was long accumulated customs that originally started with the Babylonian Ishtar. I'm going to pronounce it Ishtar. That's not how you pronounce it. It's Ishter. It's actually pronounced Easter. But I'm going to call it Ishtar to make a distinction. Okay? But the goddess of Ishtar was the goddess of fertility and harvest, and the goddess of sex. And over time, as all these other, same like goddesses and mythical gods were integrated in, the rabbit and the colored egg became part of the tradition. The rabbit, some scholars even believe the rabbit was also symbolic, along with, had relevant symbolism along with Ishtar way back when. Okay? There's a lot of debate about that. But that's where we're going to end up. This controversy begins, so here's how the argument was approached. That's what was really behind the argument. But comes along Pope Victor. See him there? See Victor?
I see him.
In 198 AD, he calls the very first so-called church council. All right? This is the very first official Roman Catholic council. What was the issue? Those daggum home fellowships, especially in Asia, will not change their worship day of the Passover from the 14th of Nisan to always being on a Sunday, part and parcel the way that Easter is worshipped in Roman culture. Okay? So, supposedly, and this is the way compromise always happens, the date is the issue. They make the date the issue. The first century, or the Christians, the elder-led Christians of the home assembly say, hey, look, we've done it this way since the beginning of Christ. For almost 400 years we've done it like this. Or almost 300 years we've done it like this. Okay? It's on the 14th of Nisan. And sometimes that ends up being a Tuesday, sometimes that ends up being a Wednesday. You know, if it ends up being on a Sunday, fine, that's when we're going to worship it. But no, it's not going to be on Sunday of every year. It's 14th of Nisan. Now, you know, why would they quibble about something that seems, even the Apostle Paul said, don't be, put all of this emphasis on days, right? And I'm sure that's one of the arguments. Well, look, the Christians knew what the real issue was. They wanted to integrate the Passover into this Easter, this Roman Easter, Greco-Roman Easter celebration. What's the problem with that? Well, in the first place, the emphasis is resurrection. The emphasis is new life. The emphasis is fertility. Okay? To the Christians, that wasn't the theme of the Passover at all. The death of Christ. What did Christ say to remember?
The Lord's death till he come.
Right. The Lord's death till he comes. It was about the death of Christ, and it was about the new covenant to Israel. Okay? So, Victor forms this first, we might as well call it, effectively, the first Roman Catholic Council. Okay? Victor basically excommunicates elder-led churches. This is what it boils down to. Victor excommunicates by letter all of you can effectively call this the day that the Roman Catholic Church excommunicated all other Christianity. Okay? Right here. Alright? So, this is 198 AD, and you still have this tension going on. I assume most of the Christian assemblies said, so the bishops of Rome excommunicated us. Whoop-de-doo. Okay. And then just went on normally how they went on. Well, the bishops of Rome keep hammering to marry church and state. Keep hammering to marry church and state. Kept integrating customs together, la-di-da, la-di-da. Why today is the emphasis of Easter resurrection? Because that was the emphasis of the Greco-Roman culture and the goddess of Ishtar and Easter and all, whatever you called it. Okay, let the scholars argue that. But today, that's why resurrection is the emphasis, which it shouldn't be. All right, it's glorious, the resurrection is glorious, but it really wasn't the true theme of what Christ called for to remember. Okay, so basically, they keep on pounding away at this. So in around 350 AD or so, what finally happens in Rome? And Rome, the bishops of Rome, keep hammering away to get in bed with the government for the purpose of what? Enforcing their orthodoxy. Instead of these stinking peasant Christians in Asia and elsewhere thumbing their nose up at the bishopry, hey, if we get in bed with the government, guess what? Our orthodoxy can be enforced, correct? Mm-hmm. Now, the Roman Catholic Church makes a big deal of all of these church fathers and stuff who were martyred, all right? Well, they were martyred for political reasons, because from the very beginning, the bishopry, the Roman bishopry, was involved in all kinds of political intrigue, just like the Puritans were. A lot of the Puritans who were so-called martyrs were executed for treason, okay? They basically were sticking their nose into politics, okay? But at any rate, so what happened in what finally happens in around 350 at Constantine, right? So, Constantine makes it the law that Passover, which is no longer Passover, is celebrated on Easter Sunday, with resurrection being the emphasis, okay? He made it law, and this happened primarily, I believe, in the Council of Nicaea in 325, all right, where this was revisited and actually made law. And here was one of the issues, and this is a quotation by Constantine from the Council of Nicaea, page 52. Said Constantine, "And truly, in the first place, it seems to everyone a most unworthy thing that we should follow the customs of the Jews in the celebration of the most holy solemnity, who are polluted wretches." So he's calling the Jews polluted wretches. "Having stained their hands with a nefarious crime, are justly blinded in their minds. It is fit, therefore, that rejecting the practice of this people, we should perpetuate to all future ages the celebration of this rite in a more legitimate order, okay, which we have kept from the first day of our Lord's Passion, even in the present times." Lie. "Let us then have," well, speaking of Rome, not the rest of Christianity, "let us then have nothing in common with the most hostile rabble of the Jews." And again, that's from the Council of Nicaea. This is how Passover became Easter. It's why we worship it the way we do today. It's why we do the Lord's table the way that we do it today. Okay? It's what makes Easter. And I venture to say, you can go to an institutional church and say, well, okay, it's about resurrection, focus on that, okay? But it's really a radical departure from Christ's intentions from the beginning. Okay, so that's how we get there. That's how we get from the early church's recognition of Passover for 300 years after Pentecost to where we are today in Easter. And that is the study.
The study of Constantine and his so-called conversion and what he did with the early church to make it the Holy Roman Catholic Church, the beginnings of it, is really very eye-opening. Constantine never really confessed to be a Christian at all. Maybe on his deathbed he might have become converted, but his whole purpose was to paganize Christianity.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Yeah.
to Christianize paganism, but to paganize Christianity.
Well, you know, all of the Jewish holidays come close to our Christian holidays.
And that was designed
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
by the Catholic
yeah,
Church
because
to kind of cancel out the...
you have what's the holiday close to Christmas, and they
Hanukkah.
give gifts.
Hanukkah.
Yeah, and they give gifts.
Hanukkah and Christmas.
They send
Passover.
cards.
And I don't know, some kind of recognition of Christmas or, well, you know, that's an area I haven't studied, but I can't think of anywhere in the New Testament where the church or in historical Christianity where the church is called on to recognize the birth of Christ.
Just his death.
Right. Hanukkah, I'm not sure what that
That's
is.
the festival of Feast of Lights. Took place during the Maccabees,
Ah,
where the menorah, where God allowed the menorah to burn, even though they only had oil for one day, and it burned for the entire time. So
They light one
candle
a
a
day.
day for that, and it's in celebration of the Maccabees' rebellion against the Roman government and God's deliverance during that time.
okay.
It's from the book of Maccabees, which is not part of our canon of scripture.
I think it's interesting that they all got drunk on. I can't believe that.
Yeah, go to church to get drunk. Yeah.
Well, you know, you're talking people who were saved out of a culture
Yeah.
that was so decadent
Debauchery,
Yeah.
that abstaining from going to the temple prostitutes was probably to them some radical life,
Well,
you know, transformation.
you know, the Jews were, I mean, during all this period of time, they were enslaved and, you know, so I don't, it's kind of hard to, because they were the first Christians.
Right.
Yep.
All right. Well.
So I think we need to Judaize Christianity more than we need to Christianize the Jews.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that. Okay. Absolutely no
I
doubt
can
about
remember
that.
when I was pregnant with David, I thought that's a sensitive thing, and I didn't know how I was going to handle it. And so finally, because he was such a nut anyway, you might start out to have a decent conversation and it would go really